Free speech, brother. Let's talk about that. Now, there's some things that I want to get to. Let's talk about core principles of what free speech is. The idea that the Voltairean idea, Voltaire idea of I will defend your right to say something even if I disagree with it, even to my death. That is something that Voltaire is allegedly is had to promote. But the idea is the simple one that even if you disagree with somebody, there's no right to censor them. And I want to get to the core belief behind that is if you don't like what people say, you don't censor them. You, in fact, allow more speech. And that's the best way to deal with speech that you don't like. Historically, this has proven the best way to deal with problems nationwide in a small setting or a large setting. It's the best possible way to deal with things because it allows for open debate and open discussion. Censorship shuts down discussion. So what we're seeing going on right now in all the social media sites as they're shutting down the president's voice and a number other conservative groups, and I'm sure after tonight's show, if not some show in the future, they're going to shut down our voice or try to, and we'll deal with that accordingly. But the idea goes back much further, and I like to use always this example when people try to challenge me on this and why you should allow people who may even say things that you don't like that are hateful, why you should allow them. I always go back to the abolitionists. I use them as a prime example of when free speech has been infringed, and just you got to think about it because back in the abolitionist time period, and just for the those of you who are unfamiliar, that is the time period prior to the Civil War. And the abolitionist movement was an initiative started by the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, I should say, that drove Christians to see slavery as a moral evil and as a sin, and driving Americans to stand up to whoever has a slave and the slavery itself. This movement, this abolitionist movement, was considered dangerous in the South, and it was inciting violence. It was creating violence. That's what the Southern Democrats said when Republicans would go in there. Now, the idea here, and the analogy I'm talking about here is we're talking about freedom of speech. Obviously, we today can say, yes, of course, slavery is evil. But back then, there was a great divide, as you need to know if you don't know, which you probably don't know if you were sitting in some U.S. high school that doesn't talk about the Civil War or the Democrats who were running the South, and probably don't even talk about all that stuff. They probably don't know about a guy whose name is Amos Dresser, who was he went to this Lane Theological Seminary in Ohio, and he was one of the number of students who signed a declaration that because that was actually one of the places that allowed slavery in Ohio. They signed a declaration saying, we disagree with your policy and we are leaving your institute because of this policy. And he obviously went on to someplace else. But the point with this guy is his story doesn't end with him writing the statement. He then traveled the South trying to spread the news of abolition. He went into places like South Carolina, North Carolina. He ended up in Tennessee, John, and I want to talk about this one incident about freedom of speech. He ended up having pamphlets about abolition, abolishing slavery and the like, and it was very clearly what he had been speaking. He was well known at that point because of his declaration. He ended up, for different circumstances, getting taken into custody because he had this material. It wasn't that he had handed it out at that point. It was because he had that material. And he was taken in by this vigilance committee. I want to describe what the vigilance committee is. I'm going to read to you this. This is from Wikipedia, and a lot of people like to complain about it, but what's the point about saying Wikipedia is wrong? There's no reason for them to lie about this. The vigilance committees were tribunals of influential citizens. And when I say this, I want you to think about what Twitter is. I want you to think about what Facebook is, the people who run it, the organizations that run it, the people at the top, Instagram, all these different social media companies. I want you to think about who's at the top and these influential citizens and the control that they have, the influence that they have. Um, they were vested with the authority to punish persons who engaged in otherwise legal behaviors, such as disrespectful to the communities which they oversaw. These committees had the power to break up meetings, censor press, inflict punishment, and even expel someone from the community. The justification for these committees was that they protected the aspects of communal life they that could not be otherwise shielded by law. The logic was that there were times when the needs of the community took precedent over one's legal rights, and the vigilance committees did not have the respect those right have did not have to respect those rights, as their first duty was to the community as a whole, such as community standards within YouTube, within Facebook, within Twitter, these so-called community standards. You now see this same type of committee, organization, whatever you want to call it, doing the same thing in a modern day forum, which is these social media places. So the public square is under attack, just like it was back in the vigilance committee. So what happened to Amos? It's a great question. I'm glad you asked it.
I didn't ask it, but wait,
Yeah.
there's another way of phrasing that. The needs of the many shall outweigh the needs of the one. Communist
Um,
Manifesto.
yeah. I mean, well, the needs of the many, yeah, society comes first, and your individual rights, which is the complete opposite of what our country was founded on. Individual rights don't, the Constitution doesn't take a holiday, and that's the bottom line. But according to the vigilance committees and Twitter and Facebook and a lot of the other knuckleheads that are out there, and I mean that in most sincere, respectful manner, um,
With all due
they
respect.
with all due respect, those members, those
With all due
Russians
respect, Your
slash
Honor.
Democrats, those Marxists slash Democrats who are on the other side of this argument, who think it's acceptable to limit speech. Um, I also want to address,
Wait,
what
what
happened to
happened? What happened to him?
Amos. So Amos, he was tried. The evidence that was brought against him was he was accused of inciting free blacks to riot. He was accused of, I want to say that again, inciting free blacks to riot because he held the abortionist papers, the abolitionist papers. He was noted as one of the rebels who had signed the Declaration. In other words, just because he signed a piece of paper, a declaration against slavery, he was evil. So I hope this all sounds familiar, and it should be sounding familiar when you hear about what people are saying and about what President Trump was saying and the allegations. This is all tied together, and he denounced slavery and the proceedings of this kangaroo court. So he was found guilty, obviously, and their consequence for this, John, was to have him stripped and flogged for an entire hour publicly in the middle of the town square. This is the outcome of your vigilance committees. This is the outcome of your community standards. This is the outcome of all the times when you have censorship of press, because censorship of any freedom of speech, because you can now allow any type of criminal behavior to be done to people. When you lose the freedom of speech and you can have it taken away, you just go down the line of the different rights that can be violated. I mean, they stripped a guy naked in the middle of the town square and then flogged him for an hour. And it was done in the middle of the night too, John, between 11 and midnight.
It sounds almost like a mob attacked him. Like there's a, but I don't get the
It
connection
sounds
you're making
very
with
familiar.
today.
It
Like there's a
sounds very
media.
familiar to Marxists, John. That's what it sounds like. I would see this more in China. I would see that behavior more in China, and we see the same thing. They're not flogging people, but they're certainly, they're certainly
They're
cutting
doing
them
worse.
out. They're cutting them out. They're canceling them. They're censoring them. This has been going on for quite a while. This is what happened this last. I call it the Friday Night Massacre, because the Friday Night Massacre is when they started taking down the websites of conservatives, President Trump's Twitter account. That's why I call it the Friday Night Massacre. They killed freedom of speech.
Did you know that Parler is now being given 24 hours to remove all their data from the Amazon servers? Apparently,
Yep.
Amazon has the largest number of servers, and Amazon has now joined the mob, the media mob,
Mm-hmm.
and it required them to remove all their information from their servers within the next 24 hours.
Well, they can't get. It's been removed from the App Store. on Android and the Apple Store too. So it's been removed and is no longer a part of the service. So I think brother, what we're seeing here is a complete repudiation of the Constitution. The left has willfully repudiated the Constitution. I know I'm close to over time, but I want to point out one more thing. A lot of people are saying, I've seen and I've had this argument about the baker, about the baker. Well, the baker didn't have to make the cake, and this is private property, and so Twitter and Facebook and the knuckleheads in charge of that can censor whoever they want. And my argument against that is twofold. First of all, they are provided federal protections. Under the law, they are provided federal protections from the federal government, and because they're provided protections from being sued, they are actually able to. It's allowing them to earn money, and therefore, since they're collecting money off of the protection of the federal government, they are required to meet federal government standards in this case. And so consequently, that's one, is that
so what you're saying is that just because the federal government has to comply with the First Amendment right to speech, any law that they pass would have to comply with the First Amendment right to speech, so that any protection that they allegedly had or did not have from these various social networks would have to comply with the first of speech.
Right. And consequently, so-called what they call hate speech would be allowed on these platforms, because the Supreme Court has ruled that so-called hate speech is not something censorable. That was just one, though. The second rationale with that is, when we look at the baker, that is a matter of conscience. And if you are going to sit there and say that the baker is forced to make something against his conscious belief of, in this case, his belief in religion, in his religious belief, then you can say that people who refuse conscientiously to fight in a war can now be forced to fight, and they have to be forced into battle because they can no longer conscientiously object to this kind of issue. So I think if you look at it like that, then all of a sudden you say, oh, really, what happened with the baker and the victory for the baker is really based more on that than on, because it's his private property. And I've seen that from on the right side and the left side. Like, people are both arguing the case. Well, the baker can do it. Twitter can, and there's lots of other bakeries out there. No, it's not because there's lots of other bakeries out there and they can go someplace else. It's because consciously in his belief system does not get compromised, because religion is still protected in this country according to the Constitution. So they cannot take that conscious decision of my belief in God and the belief that this is immoral. He can't take that away from somebody. Whether you agree with it or not is immaterial. It's still that person's individual right to believe whatever they want. So if you want to believe about the spaghetti monster, go ahead. No, that's your conscious belief. But if you want to believe about God and about the immorality of certain behaviors, then that's also your belief too. And that, I think, is where a lot of people on both sides of the aisle are not understanding. And then maybe that's kind of like not like solid. You got to think about it too much. It's not as fun to say as, well.
I do think you're overthinking it, James. Twitter allows the Ayatollah on there, and he believes he's called for the death of all Jews and the destruction of Israel.
We'll get into that. We'll get into that when we talk about how to talk to the Marxists.
Right.
But that's also there too. But the idea, like, when somebody who tries to throw intellectual baggage at you, feel free to throw what I just said back at them and tell them, if they're for censorship, then they sit with the slave owners of the Democrats and the Marxist of China. There, you can just say that.